The world was a blur of green and brown, shadows stretching long as the early evening sun began to dip below the jagged peaks. The dense forest of the remote wildlife sanctuary seemed to swallow every noise, except for the rustling of leaves and the occasional crack of a distant branch underfoot. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. It was a place where the natural world ran wild, untouched by human hands. Yet it was also a place of deep isolation, a sanctuary that had seen the passing of seasons. But no human had set foot in 4 years. The forest had been silent for hours. The wind had stilled, leaving behind a strange kind of quiet. But it wasn't the peace that comforted the lone figure now traversing through the underbrush. It was the eerie stillness that gripped him, pulling the world into sharp focus, heightening his senses. A glaciologist turned conservationist, Ethan had spent years studying the delicate balance of the ecosystems in this secluded corner of the world. His purpose now was simple yet monumental: to document the final traces of the endangered snow leopard. He had heard rumors of the animal's last sightings in this area, rumors that had been whispered among researchers and environmentalists, but Ethan had always dismissed them. Snow leopards were elusive by nature, and the mountains were vast. But the rumors were growing more persistent. One last hope, one last chance. Ethan moved cautiously, his every step deliberate, his senses tuned to the sounds around him. The rustle of a small mammal in the undergrowth, the distant call of an owl, every sound felt amplified, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. He was well aware of how the terrain shifted around him. The ground was uneven, rocky in some places, slick with the remnants of last night's rain. He had seen signs of wildlife everywhere. A lone set of tracks, faded but unmistakable, in the mud. The tuft of fur caught in a thicket, the telltale scent of musk wafting in the air. Ethan wasn't afraid of the forest. He had spent years in it, observing, studying, recording. But tonight, as the shadows lengthened and the silence stretched long, something was different. Something was wrong. The sound of distant footsteps reached him suddenly, soft but distinct. He froze, the hairs on the back of his neck prickling. The noise was too deliberate to be an animal. Someone else was here. A flash of motion caught his eye, but when he looked, nothing was there. The forest stood still, as if nothing had ever moved. A shiver ran down his spine. There was no room for fear. Not here. Not now. The sun was nearly gone, and the first stars began to pierce the darkening sky. Ethan checked his watch. It was time to start heading back to the camp. But just as he turned, he heard it, a sound. Soft, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A low growl. His heart skipped a beat. It wasn't the growl of a typical predator, no. This was different. This was a warning. The hairs on his arms stood straight, the adrenaline pumping through his veins. His breath became shallow as he reached for his flashlight, flicking it on. The beam of light cut through the trees, casting long shadows across the underbrush. But there was nothing. Nothing except the rustling of leaves. Ethan took a cautious step forward. Another growl, closer this time. His pulse quickened. His mind raced. Snow leopards were solitary creatures, silent, patient. Was this the last one? Was it watching him? He scanned the area, every muscle taut with the instinct to flee, but also the overwhelming urge to stay and witness something no one had seen in decades. The very air seemed to thicken, charged with the tension of the hunt, a flicker of white in the shadows. Then, Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he stepped closer, his feet barely making a sound on the soft earth. He had to see it. He had to know. The rustling stopped, and for a moment the forest seemed to fall into a deeper silence, as if it too were waiting. Then, suddenly, the snow leopard appeared. It moved with grace, gliding through the underbrush with the ease of a predator. Its fur was a brilliant white, streaked with shades of gray and black, blending seamlessly with the... It was a vision of beauty and power, an apex predator, with eyes that seemed to pierce through the very core of his being. Ethan was frozen in place, staring, unable to move, as the creature came closer. The growls had stopped. The snow leopard was no longer giving warning. It was studying him, just as he had been studying it. But then, the unexpected happened. As Ethan dared to take a step forward, his foot brushed against a rock, sending a small cascade of pebbles tumbling to the ground. The sound was deafening in the quiet of the forest. The snow leopard's body went rigid, its fur bristling. It turned sharply, its eyes flashing with a dangerous intensity. Ethan held his breath, his body frozen in fear. But the snow leopard didn't pounce. Instead, it backed away slowly, slipping into the shadows. It was as if the moment had never happened. The forest was silent again, but this silence felt different. Heavy, ominous. Ethan took a slow step back, his mind racing. Had he just witnessed the last of the snow leopards? Was that the creature he had come here to find? He couldn't be sure. He had come for answers, but now he had more questions than ever. He didn't hear the sound of the predator following him. Instead, he felt an oppressive weight, a presence in the air, watching, waiting. His flashlight flickered as if in response to the tension thickening around him. The growls returned, but this time they weren't from the leopard. They came from behind him. From deeper within the forest, another pair of eyes glimmered in the shadows. The twist came with the sudden realization. He wasn't alone. The snow leopard wasn't the only one watching him. A mother and her cubs. Ethan's chest tightened. The presence that had been watching him was not just a singular predator, but a family, an ancient legacy. The last of the snow leopards. In that moment, Ethan understood. This wasn't just a sanctuary. It was a battleground for survival, the last of a species. His presence here, unknowingly, had disturbed the delicate balance. But now, as he stood alone in the darkening forest, surrounded by the whispers of unseen creatures, he knew that this moment, this confrontation, would change everything. The snow leopards were fading into the shadows once again. The forest was quiet, but Ethan could feel the weight of the mystery settling over him like a thick fog. He had come searching for answers, but the truth was far more complex than he could have imagined. As he slowly made his way back to the camp, he couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was watching him, waiting, like the creatures that called it home. There were no clear answers, only questions. And in the end, the only certainty was that the last snow leopards were fading into history, quietly slipping into the wilderness. But perhaps, in the silence of the forest, they would live on in the shadows forever. And Ethan, he would never forget the weight of those eyes that had watched him from the darkness. Ethan's steps grew heavier as the realization began to settle in his chest. The forest around him seemed to close in tighter, its silence no longer peaceful but oppressive, as if the trees themselves were holding secrets that no human was meant to uncover. He moved swiftly now, instinctively picking up the pace toward the camp. His mind raced with the weight of the encounter, but even as his body pushed forward, he felt a part of him lingering in the shadows, in the place where the snow leopard and its family had been. As he neared the edge of the forest, the sky above had darkened completely. The stars shimmered in their infinite array, but for Ethan, their beauty only heightened the sense of isolation. It was as if the world had drawn a line marking the boundary between what he knew and what he was yet to discover. The crunch of his boots on the snow seemed deafening in the stillness of the night. Every crack of ice underfoot felt like a warning. Every whisper of wind a reminder that the forest could change its mood in an instant. He glanced back one final time, but the trees were still, their shadows cast long by the moonlight. No movement. No sign of the leopards. But that didn't mean they were gone. He knew that. Reaching the camp, he stepped inside the small, modest structure, a simple cabin made of wood and stone, nestled against the side of a ridge. The fire still burned faintly, casting dancing shadows against the walls. There was warmth here, but it felt shallow compared to the cold grip of the wilderness outside. The place smelled of earth, of sweat, of the past few days' work. Gear scattered across the floor, papers spread out on the small wooden table. Ethan sat down, his muscles aching, his mind still trapped in the world he had just left. He had been prepared for anything, a moment of awe, perhaps, in seeing the snow leopard in the wild, but this was something else entirely. The encounter had not been one of discovery, but of recognition. The leopards weren't just disappearing from the forest, they were fading from the world itself. The last of their kind, standing on the precipice of extinction. The sudden sound of a distant crash, something heavy, something large, breaking through the forest, made him start. His pulse quickened, and for a moment, the tension from earlier flooded back. It was too close, too sudden. He stood quickly, his hand reaching for the rifle that lay by his side. But the sound faded almost as quickly as it came, and Ethan was left standing, staring at the doorway, listening to the wind that had begun to rise once again. The sudden intensity of the moment left him breathless. It wasn't just the threat of danger, he had felt that before. While camping in the wild, while studying wildlife in its natural habitat, it was the sense that something larger than him was unfolding, something ancient and unyielding. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady himself, but the air felt thicker now, more suffocating. He stepped outside, cautiously, keeping low. The forest stretched out before him, a vast dark sea of trees and snow, swaying and shifting in the night. The moonlight painted the landscape with an eerie glow. He paused, listening. The sounds of the forest, the distant calls of owls, the crackling of branches had resumed, but now there was something new. A faint noise, coming from the direction he had come from earlier. It was low, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. Ethan's chest tightened. It wasn't just the wind. It was something moving through the trees. His heart hammered in his chest as he stepped cautiously toward the sound, the cold air biting at his skin, the darkness pressing in around him. The noise was louder now, more distinct. He reached for the rifle, but there was a hesitation in his hand. This wasn't a predator's growl. It wasn't the sound of danger. It was a sound of something, searching. A soft rustle of fur against the snow caught his ear, and his eyes darted to the movement. There, just within the tree line, he saw it, those familiar eyes, glowing faintly in the night. For a moment, he thought it was an illusion, a trick of the light, but the eyes stayed. The snow leopard was back. It didn't move towards him this time, but stayed just at the edge of the trees, its form barely visible against the dark backdrop of the forest. It seemed to be watching him still, but there was something different about it now, calm, almost resigned, as if it knew something that Ethan didn't. For several moments, neither of them moved. Ethan's breath was shallow, his fingers cold against the rifle, but he didn't raise it. This was not a time for fear, not for attack. It was a time for understanding. The snow leopard's eyes flickered for a brief second, and then, just as quickly as it had appeared, turned and vanished back into the shadows, swallowed whole by the night. Ethan stood frozen, his heartbeat hammering in his ears. It was gone, but the unease remained. He didn't return to the cabin immediately. Instead, he stepped further into the forest, moving through the shadows, guided only by the faint glow of the moon. The snow leopard had disappeared, but the presence of its family, the air was frigid now, and with each step deeper into the wilderness, the weight of the forest seemed to grow heavier. The wind had picked up again. Ethan's thoughts, tangled in confusion, fear, and the undeniable sense that something was coming. Something was changing. There, ahead of him, just beyond the tree line, he saw movement again, faint, but unmistakable. Not the lone figure of the snow leopard, but the flicker of a larger shape moving through the underbrush. It was the mother, the one he had sensed before, and behind her, small forms moved with her, silent but certain. The cubs. They were here. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as he watched them move, their fur blending perfectly with the snow. the last family of snow leopards, living on the edge of extinction. Their survival now, more uncertain than ever, was a fragile thing woven into the very fabric of the wilderness, a balance between predator and prey, between survival and destruction. And yet, there was hope in that moment. To hope in the quiet determination of the snow leopards, in the resilience that had kept them alive for generations. They weren't just surviving, they were adapting, moving through the world on their own terms. Ethan didn't know what the future held for them, for the sanctuary, for this land that had been untouched by time. But as he watched the leopards vanish into the night, their forms disappearing once again into the shadows of the forest, he understood one thing. The wilderness was not a place of answers, but a place of constant questions. And perhaps that was the greatest mystery of all. Ethan stood alone in the stillness, his breath visible in the cold air, chest tight with the weight of everything he had witnessed. The snow leopards, elusive as shadows, had vanished, leaving only the soft whisper of the wind through the trees. For a long moment, he wasn't sure if he wanted to risk disturbing the fragile silence, or if he was simply too stunned to act. The forest felt different now. No longer just a cold, vast expanse, but a living, breathing entity that held mysteries far beyond his understanding. It was both ancient and untamed, with secrets woven into every branch, every snowfall, and every fleeting shadow. His feet, numb and heavy in the snow, finally shifted. Slowly he began to walk back, but not to the cabin, not yet. There was something about the path the snow leopards had taken that called to him, urging him forward, even though the safe retreat of the cabin was just a few hundred yards away. He had come all this way, pushed himself to the edge of endurance, seeking something, anything that could shed light on the mysteries of this wild, frozen world. And now he had found it, or at least he had found part of it. The snow was deep where he walked, crunching under his boots with each step. He moved carefully, his senses alert to every creak of ice, every rustle of snow. The tracks of the snow leopards were faint now, nearly covered by the gusts of wind, but Ethan knew what to look for. He followed the soft imprint of paw prints in the snow, each step a whisper of something extraordinary, something he was privileged to witness, something fleeting. The forest around him remained eerily quiet, save for the wind, which howled through the trees in gusts that seemed to carry with them fragments of a forgotten song. The world felt remote, untouched, as if time itself had stopped in this wild expanse. Then, the world shifted. Ethan froze in place. The unmistakable sound of a low, guttural growl echoed through the trees, sharp and filled with threat. His instincts flared, but there was no panic. He knew this growl. It was the sound of the female snow leopard, the protector, the guardian of her cubs. He had been too careless, too caught up in the fragile beauty of the moment, and now she was making her presence known. The growl was not one of anger, but a warning, a statement of intent. Ethan was too close, and she was not going to let him get any closer. His heart pounded in his chest, but his mind remained steady. He had seen the snow leopards before, understood their movements, their grace, their quiet power, but he had never felt this close to one before, if it's close to a mother. The growl echoed again, closer this time. Ethan could feel the weight of her presence, the invisible force pressing down on him, even though he couldn't see her. He wasn't afraid, not in the way he had been in the past with other predators. This was different. He felt a sense of awe, a quiet reverence for the animal that had been born into this harsh world and fought to survive within it. Ethan didn't dare move. He remained still, holding his breath, his senses stretched to their limits. His eyes scanned the trees, the shadows, waiting for the slightest movement, the softest shift of the wind. And then it came. A flash of fur. Her golden eyes gleamed in the dim moonlight, and for the briefest of moments, their gazes locked human and predator across the vast emptiness of the forest. Her gaze was steady, unwavering, as though she was assessing him, not as a threat, but as something different. something apart from the human world she had learned to fear. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan's heart pounded, not from fear, but from the profound realization that he had crossed a threshold. He was no longer a mere observer of the wild. He had become part of it, his fate intertwined with theirs. He understood in that moment that the snow leopards did not need him. They had survived without human interference for centuries. They were not dependent on him. If anything, it was he who was dependent on them, their resilience, their tenacity, their quiet strength. The female leopard lingered for a heartbeat longer, her eyes reflecting the pale light of the moon, before she slowly melted back into the darkness, disappearing into the trees as silently as she had come. Ethan stood motionless, every fiber of his being attuned to the sound of the wind, the rustling of branches, the soft crunch of snow underfoot. But there was no further movement. The forest returned to its calm state, as though the encounter had never happened, and yet Ethan knew it had. He turned back toward the cabin then, slowly, the weight of the experience settling heavily on his shoulders. The night felt colder now, but there was a strange warmth inside him. A quiet understanding. The last snow leopard was not alone, not in the way he had feared. The sanctuary was not just a place for protection, but a reminder that the wilderness could still hold its own, could still find its way through the modern world. Even in the face of everything that threatened it, human encroachment, climate change, the relentless march of time, life could persist, could adapt. But what had struck him most, what would stay with him, was the certainty that the snow leopard would not disappear quietly. It would fight. It would survive so long as the forest remained, so long as the balance could hold. Ethan knew, deep in his bones, that he was not witnessing the end of something. He was witnessing the beginning of something else, something profound, something far greater than any one individual. And as he made his way back to the cabin, leaving the cold wilderness behind him, he felt a quiet reverence for the wild things that lived on, hidden in the shadows of the world. The last snow leopard had not been a finality. It had been a symbol of resilience,